So good evening, and thank you for being here, whether you are here in person or joining us on Zoom. And thank you to the Research and Publication Group for inviting me here today to do an author talk about my book, which is a history behind the hard winter of 1880-81 as found in the newspaper records. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book.
You're not on.
Some similarities and differences between what was found in the newspaper record and how the winter was portrayed by Ingalls Wilder in her novel, The Long Winter. And then I'm going to share a couple of things that I found particularly fascinating along the way. So as Cody mentioned, my ideal day is about 80 degrees with a little bit of humidity. So why on earth did I spend several years researching a notoriously bad winter? But it started innocently enough. I had my book club read The Long Winter. We had just finished a couple of months of some pretty heavy stuff. And I thought, let's do a young adult novel and lighten the mood a little bit. So this may not have been the best choice to lighten the mood, but just go along with me here. My schedule had fallen on October, so that was the month I was to lead book club, which is the beginning of the hard winter. And as a big fan of the Little House novels, I thought, perfect, we're going to read The Long Winter. But I knew that they would have questions and want to know how things really were compared to what they were going to read in the novel. So I started to do some research. And it wasn't long until I wanted to know a lot about how the historic record compared to what was in the novel. And as I joke, things got a little bit out of hand from there. While browsing old county history books, I was finding generalized statements and a lot of hyperbole, but not really the level of detail that I was hoping for. And then a book published about Pipestone County, Minnesota, handled the winter by taking articles that had been published at the time in their newspaper and then adding commentary around it. And that's when the light bulb went on, not out, on. And because I realized, the newspaper record is going to have all the answers I'm looking for. After all, the weekly newspapers are really about as close as we can come to knowing how things really were on the ground at the time as the winter unfolded, before nostalgia and mythology started to play a role in it all. So I spent several weeks buried in the archives here in Pierre, and the archival staff here is phenomenal. If you ever need any reason to do research here. And also in St. Paul and some county historical societies. And in the process, I collected about 3,000 articles on various topics connected to life that winter. I then transcribed them and then sorted them by topics. And then I sorted them again by the railroad line they were connected to, and then put them in chronological order, and then started color coding because things were getting out of hand. And then I realized that there was some good stuff there. And as much as I was enjoying it, I knew that other people were also going to find it interesting. And so here we are. So what all did I find? I found many similarities between the novel and the historic record, such as the horrific weather. The newspaper record shows cold and snow definitely worthy of the mythology that has built up around this winter. And while it wasn't as consistently dangerous as portrayed in the novel, it wasn't a lot better either. And some of the storms line up exactly as they did in the novel, such as that first one in October and the one that hit around Christmas. A good example of a weather description is this one from the December 30th, 1880 Brookings County Press. Sunday was a terror.
TV, Olympics, please.
Sunday was a terror. It snowed and it blowed and it drifted until it seemed as though the whole country was to be inundated. But Monday it let up somewhat, and now all is serene once more. Another topic that lined up beautifully compared with the novel was the lack of fuel, which became a problem right away with that first October storm. The people of the newly settled western districts were suffering terribly for fuel. People not only pulled down and burned their fences, but also burned their machinery. So think about how desperate they were for heat. If they were willing to burn their expensive farm equipment, which they had probably purchased on credit at terms and interest rates that would be considered illegal today. By November, people were burning hay, corn, furniture, and in fact, anything they could get their hands on. And by the end of the winter, there were reports of families combining households so that they could take apart and burn the abandoned house for heat. Also over the winter, people pulled up railroad ties, cut up railroad bridges, railroad trestles, and also burned that wood for heat. So there were similarities, but there were also some really big differences. With that said, before we continue, I do want to say that the town of DeSmet does appear to have been in a narrow band of towns that suffered the worst of the deprivations, though probably not to the full extent as portrayed in the novel. As found in the newspaper record, I found two particular topics that were almost shocking in scale to me, and that actually kind of shifted my entire perspective about the winter. And it took me a while to adjust to it, to one of them actually. First, I'm going to mention food. Across the larger region, lack of food really didn't become much of a problem until toward the end of winter, right before the trains came through. Most places either had plenty of food on hand, or they were near enough a town that did have food that they sent people to those other towns to bring food in. And for the most part, when food was running low, it tended to be things like sugar, coffee, or other nice-to-haves versus the nutritionally needed food, at least until about the last month of the winter. But far and away, the biggest surprise for me was the unrelenting efforts by all of the railroad companies to continue to fight the snow from that very first October storm all the way until they finally broke the last blockade in May. The most fascinating articles for me were definitely the descriptions of the shoveling crews and the snow plows as they tried over and over to get the snow cleared away so that a train could hopefully get west before the next storm came through and filled all those cuts up again. But what was a cut? Simply a cut is where a hill existed, but the railroad wanted to go straight through that hill, not up and over. So the crew cut out the hill. The problem was that snow, rather than blowing over the cut, would blow into the cut, swirl around, get trapped, get compacted, turn into ice, and just cause problems. And in the first years after railroad construction, most of these cuts were just narrow enough for the train to go through. The problem was the more narrow the cut, the more likely it was to trap snow. So problem upon problem compounding itself. And by the end of the winter, there were reports of ice several feet thick sitting on top of the rails in some of these big cuts. These photos were taken in late March and early April of 1881, and they illustrate part of the problem. The photo on the left shows how men had to create tiers to get the snow up and away from the tracks. So the men at the bottom would shovel it up as high as they could reach, then the men at that level would shovel it up as high as they could reach, and so on until they could get the snow tossed far enough away from the tracks not to fall back in. On the right-hand photo, if you look up in the upper right corner, you can see that the surrounding land really has very little snow cover compared to what's built up within that cut. And it's so compacted that there's a man standing right at the edge and it is supporting him. This photo was taken on March 29th, 1881, west of Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. And it does a pretty fantastic job of showing just how much snow was built up along some of these cuts. And while there were plows at work, they seem to have spent a considerable amount of time derailed after hitting a snowbank just a little too hard. And a good percentage of the snow clearing efforts that winter were actually done by shovelers. Whether they were paid or volunteered, they were out along all the railroad lines all winter. And frozen hands, faces, and feet were common, as was snow blindness. Now, for shovelers who were paid, this was a pretty nice little bit of extra income, but it came at the expense of, they were burning a lot of energy, and that required a lot more food to rebuild. And while food wasn't as scarce as portrayed in the long winter, it wasn't exactly plentiful either. So it was kind of a bit of a trade-off there. Articles at the end of the winter calculated that the line that went from Winona, Minnesota, out to Watertown, Dakota Territory, had spent the modern equivalent of $1.8 million on the January blockades alone. And that was just 1 month on one line across the region. And this particular photo is actually from 1917, not from the hard winter, but I use it because it just does such a nice job of showing what can happen when the locomotives try to blow through a snowbank. The upside is that usually there was enough snow along the side of the tracks that the locomotive didn't completely derail, so they could get back on the tracks a little faster. While the ongoing efforts of the railroad companies was a big contrast to what was in the novel, the problems encountered at the end of the winter were pretty
What?
severe.
You're taking those joint deals too, right?
Yep, I got me some more.
When all of the snow that had fallen melted, it caused historic flooding, and that floodwater washed out miles and miles and miles of tracks and bridges. And then remember that throughout the winter, people had been pulling up ties and cutting up bridges and trestles. And all of that repair had to be made before the trains could.
I'm on the phone.
Could safely run again. And not only that, throughout the winter, trains that could get no farther west would leave their loaded cars along sidings and side tracks along the way. So that as spring came, there was an astounding number of full rail cars parked along hundreds of miles of tracks across this region. And the complexity of unraveling the intended destination of all those goods had to have been absolutely mind-boggling. And that was all before computerization. At the end of the novel, the people in De Smet were very angry when the first train into town brought farming equipment. There was an article out of Lake Benton, Minnesota that complained of the exact same thing, wondering why food hadn't been brought in ahead of farm equipment. Timing-wise, this might be the same train that angered the residents of De Smet. Unfortunately, the fastest way to get food to the isolated towns was likely to get all those cars hauled farther west, emptied out, so that they could be brought back east, refilled with necessities, and then brought back again. And that took months in some cases. In the novel, the Ingalls family waited for that Christmas barrel, and it reached them in May. But according to Wilder, in reality, that Christmas barrel reached them sometime in June because of the tangle of bacteria. So beyond the similarities and differences, there were many things that I found fascinating. And here I'm going to share a little bit about newspapers and boosterism. The production of a weekly newspaper on those old letterpress machines absolutely fascinated me, and I went down some real deep rabbit holes with this one. I visited several locations like living history museums that have old presses and those drawers full of letters. And those letters are unimaginably small. At the very tip of that piece of metal is the letter which, depending on the type of press used, may also be backwards and upside down, so that it would print properly on the paper. Then all those letters had to be assembled into words, usually left to right in reverse as shown in this particular headline. And then all those letters and words were assembled into articles and then into columns to fill the piece of newsprint. Then after the edition was printed, somebody had to clean the ink off all those letters and then disassemble them all and put the individual letters back into the right compartment in the tray to be ready for next week's newspaper. The top image is an insert diagram showing which letters went into which compartment. So not unlike a modern keyboard or typewriter, letters were grouped by commonly used combinations. And you had to be careful when you ordered these because there were more than one scheme of how these trays were laid out. So you had to be sure you ordered a set of letters, or at least the insert diagram in the trays, to match whatever system you had been taught. And typesetters now reassure me that once you got used to it, you could assemble these things as quickly as a person can type, but I still am not sure. So with all that cold air, because even the warmest of rooms were not wonderfully warm, I'm thinking, the fingers had to be stiff. So working with these tiny pieces of metal to put these newspapers together must have been just all that much harder. And now when I find typos in some of these old articles, I wonder if it's because somebody put the letter back in the wrong compartment in some previous week. The newspaper editors had a tough time that winter. They were expected to put out a newspaper once a week. The residents depended on them for news, but a lot of them also published those legal notices, so they were kind of legally bound to publish once a week. But the editors depended on the mail coming through for correspondence and other newspapers to harvest things to put in their own editions. And they also needed those trains coming in with the paper on which to print on. And with the mails and the trains delayed, they had to get creative. At first, they'd print on a half sheet of paper, and then they'd switch to the brown paper that butchers use to wrap their paper in, or the meat. Or some of them printed on linen. So all of the newspapers in this image are actually fabric newspapers. The Del Rapids Exponent printed on wallpaper. Here's the front side of an article, and here's its back side. So not only is this a lovely example of the creativity on the part of the printer, but it lets us see what some of the decorating styles were at the time. The same newspaper also found handkerchiefs. During research, this was a particular interesting one to me because, you know, the wrapping paper, wallpaper, even the linen, they're stiff enough that I could see them standing up to the printing process. But I wasn't so sure about handkerchiefs because they're usually a lot flimsier. But it's held up really well for 141 years now. And it's actually printed on both sides, and you can read both sides perfectly fine. The handkerchief, the wallpaper, and the linen ones are all at the Siouxland Heritage Museums in downtown Sioux Falls. And I had the chance to see them last week, and it was amazing. But the handkerchief was much bigger than I expected. It's about this large. And you could read every word of it. It was impressive. One of my favorite finds from the winter was this article out of the March 24th, 1881 Pipestone Star. Our butchers, being out of wrapping paper, they have conceived the novel idea of using sharpened sticks, and it is nothing uncommon to see people going through the streets with parasols made of a hunk of roast beef or a round steak. I had my book's illustrator use this scene to start the March chapter. We used a photo of Laura Ingalls Wilder wearing a winter coat and hat to be the model for this woman walking through the streets with her roast beef on a stick. And a note before we move on, This journey began because I was curious about what was happening in DeSmet, but there's only one known page of a newspaper from DeSmet from the hard winter. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I remain hopeful that at some point they're going to remodel or tear down one of these old buildings, and there, insulating the walls, is going to be found the entire editions of the hard winter out of DeSmet. So if you know firemen who like to practice on buildings, make sure they check the walls first. And it could happen. When they first acquired the Ingalls home in DeSmet and they were doing some plaster repair, they found an 1890 DeSmet paper lining the walls. The next interesting topic was rather fun and entertaining, though it complicates things for the researcher, and that is boosterism, which can be defined as overly exuberant marketing. Here's a beautiful example from Watertown. We had one day where the thermometer marked 37 degrees below zero. In Dakota's atmosphere, the editor claimed, that was the equivalent to the more balmy 20 in Wisconsin, Michigan, or New York. I suppose it's maybe the frontier equivalent of, but it's a dry heat. Little seemed to irritate the Western editor more than concerns from Easterners about the livability out west. The January 24th, 1881 edition of the Dakota News out of Watertown was a special edition focused entirely on elevating the Watertown area specifically and Dakota territory in general in the minds of those thinking about moving out west to set up a farm or business and raise a family. Aside from the 4,000 copies that the editor himself sold to local subscribers, the Chicago and Northwestern ordered 20,000 copies to have available on their own trains to help lure people out to Dakota. This issue included things like a detailed list of the various ways people could obtain land, like homesteading, purchasing it outright, military scrip, tree claims, etc., and how to do each of those steps. It talked about what kind of businesses were already in town, what kind of businesses were lacking, and thus there was a nice opportunity. And it also very smartly appealed to women, telling how good the residents were, how upstanding the people were, that there were schools and churches, and that this was a perfect place to raise your family. Because they knew that if the wives weren't on board, the husbands were going to have a much harder time uprooting the family to move to Dakota. Also within this special edition were retorts to papers back east. And keep in mind that back east to a Dakota editor could have been as close as Minnesota. In one of the edition's more adamant articles, the editor noted incredulously that one Eastern paper had reported that Watertown has been blown all to pieces by a blizzard. This is but a sample of 1,000 wild stories floating all over the East that have not, in fact, a shadow of foundation. Not a house or even a shanty has been blown down or injured in any particular, nor has anyone been frozen to death. The paragraph then ended with that previous quote about how 37 below in Dakota feels like 20 in New York. He did not, however, include anything about the days when snow would drift up to the second floor of the buildings in towns. So during research, I found many interesting things that enriched the history of the winter, as well as the similarities like the weather and the fuel, and the differences like the railroad company and the food between the historic record and Wilder's novel. So did Wilder lie to us? No. In fact, she often went out of her way to verify certain memories. And if she did want to invent something for the books, she often took time to justify the how and the why of it, and how it either furthered the story or kept things from being too complicated. Her autobiography, published as Pioneer Girl by the South Dakota History Press in 2014, provides her personal memories of the winter, and that served as the basis for the plot line for The Long Winter. Letters between Wilder and her daughter Rose do a good job of documenting her thought processes as she took her memories and evolved them into the finished novel. And we must always remember that the Little House books are works of fiction, even if strongly based in her childhood experiences. And as we've learned from the newspaper archives, Wilder remembered some things very differently, perhaps, than how they actually took place. But as we know, memory can be a tricky thing. Take 10 people who experience a particular event, wait 50 years, and then ask those 10 people to recount that event, and you're likely going to get 10 different versions. It doesn't mean that any of them are lying to you. It just means they have different memories of the events from different perspectives. As she struggled to establish a plot line in the novel from her memories, she wrote to Rose, "Here is what is bothering me and holding me up. I can't seem to find a plot, or a pattern as you call it. There seems to be nothing to it, only the struggle to live through the winter until spring comes again. This, of course, they all did, but is it strong enough, or can it be made strong enough to supply the necessary thread running all through the book?" I'd say she succeeded spectacularly, as many people consider The Long Winter the best of the series. And I also think it might be the shortest time frame, and it's one of the biggest books. So don't quote me on that, but I think it's right up there. So it's a beautiful piece of historical fiction, and the histories found in the newspaper record is every bit as interesting. So with all of the terrible suffering that happened during the hard winter, why did I name my book The Beautiful Snow? Throughout the winter, there were frequent mentions of the beautiful snow across the newspaper record. Editors would mention that there wasn't enough of the beautiful to make for good sledding, or that there were piles and piles of the beautiful blocking the wagon roads, or that a nice consequence of the delayed mails was that they did not have to receive poems from correspondents about the beautiful. In 1871, there'd been a book of poems published that made its way into general culture, and the title poem was called The Beautiful Snow, and its first verse reads like this: "Oh, the snow, the beautiful snow, filling the sky and the earth below, over the housetops, over the street, over the heads of the people you meet." Among the many mentions of the beautiful snow in the newspaper, the one that caught my attention and led to the title of the book appeared in a January newspaper. "Oh, the snow, the beautiful snow, filling the cuts so the trains can't go." So I've shared just a small sample of the stories that I found in the research, which began as a journey just to satisfy my own curiosity and then kind of blossomed from there. So thank you, and I'd love to take questions. Lots more to talk about.
We'll do questions in person first, and then we'll take the Zoom questions after that. So if you have any, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about how many of these snow shovelers were volunteers versus paid workers?
The question was if I have a sense of how many of the shovelers were paid versus volunteer, and no, there wasn't any one source. It was just kind of anecdotal through the articles. I would say that as the winter wore on, they became more and more volunteer-based versus paid. And there were articles you could get paid 25 cents a day. At one point, it was $1.25 a day. And then towards the end of the winter, it was more volunteer, and frequently people from one town moving in mass to try and help shovel to help people in another town. But no idea how many.
Were they paid by the railroad company or by the communities where the trains were trying to get to?
By the railroad company. Oh, her question was whether they were paid by the communities that they were trying to help or by the railroad companies, and it was by the railroad companies. And, part of that $1.8 million equivalent in the January efforts for the Chicago and Northwestern, a good chunk of that would have been maybe paying shovelers, also fuel to keep the locomotives running. That was a big problem because it wasn't just the residents that were running low on fuel, the railroad companies too. And there were reports, sometimes trains in the middle of trying to clear the tracks would just run out of fuel, and they would go to nearby farms and get corn and burn corn until they could get back to where there was wood or coal to burn. And another thing to think about is these towns were very new. Once you got west of about Tracy, along all of the railroad lines that were moving west, because they were all moving west at about the same time in this year, because the Panic of 1873 had lifted, so there was just a big railroad boom. So from 79 to the end of 1880, there were multiple lines all running east-west, trying to get through. So when that first October storm hit, some of these towns were less than 6 months old. And when you think about that, people didn't necessarily know each other well, so they didn't necessarily know who they could trust, who would be a good leader, who could be trusted maybe to go to another town with the town's money to get food to bring back. Those are all factors that played in here.
Cindy, we've got a lot of questions online. If
Okay.
no one else in person has any, I'll just go through these in order. What was the time span, the true time span, Ray Wilson wants to know, of the whole winter? I think he means of the blizzards.
The first one began approximately October 15th, depending on where you were, east to west. And I believe the last storm finished around April 12th. So darn close to 6 full months of storms.
Long enough.
Definitely long enough.
And Rennie would like to know what the financial impact of the long winter was on North Dakota and the Midwest. So maybe Northern Great Plains, kind of put it all together.
I think there was a little bit of a dip in things because, think about whether you were a farmer or a merchant moving out and getting established. Just like the railroad companies, there was not a lot of income coming in. People were mostly, staying home. If you were a grocer, you were doing well if you had stock. But as things began to run low, the whole economy kind of slows down. However, there was a lot of prediction at the end of, through the winter, and especially kind of at the end, with people thinking, oh, this was a disaster and the people who are here are going to leave and nobody's gonna, on the right mind, come out. And what truly happened is in the last month or so before the blockades actually opened, people were jumping at the bit. They were piling up in towns like Sleepy Eye and Ortonville and Flandreau, kind of as far west as they could get. They were just kind of piling up. There was no room in the hotels. People were renting out space in their houses because people were anxious to get out there, get whatever land was there. So I think there was an economic blip for a very short time, but it didn't slow anything down. Once the blockades opened, it was just floodgates. People were coming out, the freight, people were kind of excited to have access to things again. The railroad companies weren't earning anything during the winter in this region because they weren't running. But, memory is a funny thing. 2 weeks past pain, you don't really remember the pain anymore. So once spring happened and people felt free, they just moved on.
That's fascinating. And the next question has to do with meteorological records. Are there records about the amount of snowfall, and have there been other years with similar amounts of snowfall or more?
This would be an excellent question for Barb Bosted Mays.
I
The
thought
other way
that-
around, Barb Mays Bosted, sorry, Barb, who is a PhD meteorologist who specializes in the winter. She did her PhD about the weather of the hard winter. There weren't meteorological records the way we expect them today. The army posts were the places where there were records kept, but I've read diaries of some of the people responsible for this, and they would talk about how on Fridays when it was time to turn in their report, they'd quick flip open their paper and write stuff that sounded good and hand it in. So we can't necessarily trust all of the records, but they're very scattered. So official records are a little dicier. The newspapers were full of, it was 37 below, or we got 3 feet of snow. How accurate is it? We don't know. And estimates ranged anywhere from 40 feet to 11 feet to, it's hard to say. And the accuracy of the equipment and who was reading it at a time. And so I don't know that I'm not the right one to talk about that, but if you go to Wilder Weather, type that into your Google, you will find access to Barb's information, and it will be much better answered than what I just did.
Are there other questions? If you're online, put them in the chat and I will forward them to Cindy or anyone in person at the Cultural Heritage Center. Raise your hand. We have lots of time left to talk all about the long winter.
We
Well,
have-
I have a question. And the hard winter, 1880, 1881 winter was really extreme. What was the impact of other winters? Did they figure out how to get the snow out of those cuts, or did they cause problems in other winters?
That is a really good question. Her question was, did they learn anything? Did the railroad companies learn anything? And how did this winter and maybe any other winters impact railroad operations? The Winona and St. Peter, so the line that started in Winona and went up to Tracy and then went up through Marshall and over to Watertown, it had been in place fully as of 1873. There were several winters. So the winter of 72 to 73, and I think also 74 to 75, had a lot of snowfall. And there were a lot of problems. In fact, Winona and St. Peter shut down west of some certain point for a good chunk of that winter. Construction was stopped. And then it melted and they kind of went, okay, we don't need to worry about that anymore until the next winter came along. After they did widen some of the worst cuts. But again, it's a cutthroat business. Railroads, they're looking at every fraction of a penny and not necessarily looking for the long game. So they probably could have done better, but it would have cost them a lot of money. And they're gambling. Are we going to have another winter like that or not? So the solutions were widening cuts, putting up snow fences. And an interesting thing is one of the 5 railroad lines that I cover in the book ran diagonal. Most of them ran east-west, but one ran from like Mankato down to Sioux City. That one did not have near the trouble that winter that the east-west routes did. And so the newspapers were saying, east-west bad, north-south might be best. And so there was a lot of clamoring to get lines intersected because they're like, we can go on our wagon roads to a town south of us or north of us and get our stuff because the wagon roads were okay. And they tried to learn some lessons of widening the cuts, but there are photos into the 50s and 60s around the Tracy cut of situations every bit as bad as some of the photos I showed you tonight. Now, while I was doing the research, every time we had a blizzard in Minnesota, I would get in my car and drive to the Tracy cut, desperately wanting to see it full of snow. And they solved that problem and I never got to see it. So, but there is a picture of a train that was stuck in the snow in southern Minnesota in February of 2019. You know, trains now are a lot taller than they were then, or the locomotives are. And it was stuck in that snowbank for 12 hours.
This is gonna echo.
But they were rescued by the National Guard versus the stories of the trains that were stranded during the hard winter.
We do have a couple of questions online, and one is preceded by some nice compliments. Great book, read it, real page turner. And then he says, in the early part of the book, you mentioned another book to be published. Are there any updates?
I have a manuscript just about ready to go to my editor, but it is not exactly the one I mentioned there because I took myself on one heck of a sidetrack. It's related, but it is not the one I plan to write next. It's a related but similar.
We'll keep our eyes open for that. And another question, were there any stories of how the long winter affected the mental health of people? All those months of cabin fever, they freak people out, perhaps?
You know, I saw not much negative. What I saw, whether it be county histories or reminiscences or, you know, articles at the 20-year anniversary, the 50-year anniversary, it had been turned into a badge of honor. And people were very proud to have participated. And there was one reminiscence that basically said you could not consider yourself a Dakota pioneer had you not been in Dakota to have experienced the hard winter. That was the cutoff as far as they were concerned. More of what I saw was, I would say, is on the end of boosterism. So affected by nostalgia, affected by the hardy Midwesterner mythos, and the sense of the stoicism. You know, we are hardy stock, and not me, no, but you know, the general. That was not much of an era for talking about the struggle part. And if people did, it was not published in the newspapers. And reminiscences tended to be of the more dramatic, heroic genre than talking about the struggles. But I can only imagine that there was some serious mental health issues, similar to what is part of the plot line of The Long Winter, with that dull mind and the listless, you know, when you've got nothing to do but grind wheat and twist hay for months on end. I don't know, I would have walked there were people who walked to Fargo to get to better weather. Remember, the storms were worse through South Dakota and western Minnesota. So people were actually going north to get to better weather.
Wow, that's fascinating. And kind of along those lines, and maybe part of the mental health, I don't know, things people had to deal with were deaths. And so there's a comment on the chat, not really a question, but a comment. Someone whose great-grandfather and his two oldest daughters froze to death in 1883 in Sanborn, North Dakota. And she also did some research at Jamestown, North Dakota, and found a report that bodies were found there. So I can imagine that there's a lot of impact just from the carnage of such a storm
Yes,
as well.
the October storm, I kind of think of it as similar to the Armistice Day blizzard. And Laura talked about it in the novel. It was warm. She didn't want to wear her warm clothes to school. It was a nice, comfortable day. So of the storms that winter, it was that first storm where we saw the casualties. There were people who froze to death out in their fields or trying to get from their barn to their house. I don't have a count. I don't know that there is even a count of for sure, but that was the most death from exposure for people that winter. The winter was horrific for animals. The carnage for the animals continued from October really until the snow started melting and they could get to grass to eat. And whether it was cold or lack of food, it was horrible. Entire herds of cows and horses and oxen and chickens and just horrible carnage for the animals. So this is gonna be kind of gross, so if you're squeamish at all or have an active imagination, squeamish, maybe plug your ears. The biggest cause of death that winter were shovelers caught in cuts when a work train came through and couldn't stop. There were a lot of articles about that. And depending on the editor, details varied.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's kind of a give people pause to think about. I don't see any more questions on the chat. If anybody has something, now's the time to pop on. And while we're waiting to see if there are more questions, just to let you know, if you are in person, Cindy's book is for sale just outside the door at the Heritage Gift Shop, and Cindy has agreed to sign copies for a little bit after her talk is over. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Deidre Berzer. I'm the director of the South Dakota Historical Society Press. And we are always wanting to grow our membership and add to the numbers of people who love South Dakota history. So if that's something that interests you, you may easily sign up to be a member and join us at the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation website, which is sdhsf.org. And I have that in the chat. And go ahead, Cindy, please.
Ben had a question too.
Ben has a question.
I was just wondering, you said DeSmit was about 200 people or so. In the population in eastern South Dakota, western Minnesota that kind of endured this, you have a sense of the numbers of people who went through that?
Yep, I think DeSmet had about 85 people. Do you still have the book, Ben, or Cody?
Yeah.
I have an appendix where I have county by county population for both southwestern Minnesota and eastern Dakota Territory. I don't remember if I added them up by state or not, but tens of thousands.
See if I can find it really quick here.
Yep.
116 in DeSmet at the time.
Okay. But across the wider region, several tens of thousands of people in each area, but I should look that number up, so.
Yes.
It isn't an appendix.
Yeah, the towns along the Dakota Central, there's over 1,000 and then, 10,000 in some spots, so yeah. Total in the 15,000 range, something like that.
Great, good to know. So inquiring minds are wondering what your next book is going to be about, if you're willing to say.
It's related to the railroad and western Minnesota and eastern Dakota Territory.
You'll just have to wait to find out, right?
A little bit longer. A little bit longer.
A little bit longer.
Yeah.
That's great. Are there any other questions? Well, I think this has just been such a fun evening, so much to think about, and we've all learned so much from Cindy. And I think her beautiful snow book is a beautiful book. And she was telling us earlier that it's printed on photo paper, so it's heavy.
It is heavy.
but really, the printing on that paper makes those photos so sharp. It's really quite a treasure and beautifully done.